September 27, 1942, Richmond, California. Crowds lined the harbor, their breath caught in disbelief. Before them, a brand-new Liberty ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, slid down the greased wooden ways into the Pacific, its hull gleaming, its deck still smelling of fresh paint. The astonishing part wasn't the ship. It was the clock. Just 4 days earlier, this 10,000-ton cargo vessel had been nothing but scattered steel plates and bolts. In less than 100 hours, welders, engineers, and ordinary laborers had done the impossible. They had built an entire ocean-going ship faster than anyone thought humanly possible. German intelligence dismissed the reports as Allied propaganda. Naval experts called it a hoax, but it was real, and behind it stood one man, Henry J. Kaiser, a civilian with no shipbuilding experience, no military background, and no patience for limits. His impossible trick didn't just launch a ship. It launched a revolution, one that turned America's shipyards into factories of freedom and changed the very rhythm of war. Because in the industrial race of World War II, speed wasn't just power, it was survival. When the Second World War began, America faced a problem that could not be solved with courage alone. The U.S. Merchant Marine, the fleet that carried weapons, fuel, and food across the oceans, was small, slow, and aging. Britain, already under siege from German U-boats, pleaded for help. Ships were being sunk faster than they could be built. In 1941 alone, the Atlantic swallowed more than 1,000 Allied vessels. The math was merciless. If the Allies couldn't replace their ships faster than Germany could sink them, the war would be lost not on the battlefield, but on the sea lanes that fed it. Traditional shipyards worked with craftsmanship and precision, but not speed. A single cargo ship could take 6 to 8 months to complete. Every rivet was hand-hammered, every plate fitted by specialists. It was a process that belonged to the 19th century, facing a war fought in the 20th. That was when an unlikely figure stepped into history. Henry J. Kaiser was not a naval man. He had never built a ship in his life. He was a contractor, a builder of dams, highways, and concrete miracles. In the 1930s, his name became synonymous with scale. He had led the construction of the Hoover Dam, the Grand Coulee, and a string of other mega-projects that had defied nature itself. His secret was simple: organization and faith in people. Where others saw problems, Kaiser saw process. He believed that massive goals could be achieved not through genius, but through coordination, through systems that allowed ordinary men and women to do extraordinary things. So when the U.S. Maritime Commission called for new shipyards in 1940, Kaiser volunteered, promising ships faster and cheaper than anyone in the world. The naval establishment laughed. He had never set foot in a shipyard, but desperation overruled tradition. Kaiser got the contract. He broke ground at Richmond, California in January 1941, on a stretch of muddy shoreline facing San Francisco Bay. Within months, he had 90,000 workers, welders, electricians, carpenters, and thousands of women who had never seen the inside of a factory. Many were migrants from the Dust Bowl and the rural South. They called themselves Kaiser's Army. What they were about to do would change modern industry forever. Kaiser refused to copy traditional methods. Riveting, the slow, clanging rhythm of every shipyard, was replaced by electric welding, a new technique that fused steel plates together in minutes instead of hours. Old shipyards called it reckless. Kaiser called it progress. He divided ship construction into prefabricated sections, each built separately in specialized areas, then moved by crane and joined like pieces of a puzzle. Instead of master shipwrights, he used assembly lines and standardized parts inspired by the auto industry. In his mind, a ship was not a handcrafted masterpiece. It was a product, and products could be built in volume. By late 1941, the first of Kaiser's Liberty ships, simple rugged cargo vessels based on a British design, were rolling out of his yards. Each measured 441 feet long, weighed over 10,000 tons, and could carry 9,000 tons of cargo at 11 knots. They were not elegant, but they were reliable and cheap. Where traditional shipbuilders saw chaos, Kaiser saw rhythm. His shipyards worked 24 hours a day, organized into overlapping shifts. Floodlights turned night into day. Cafeterias ran around the clock. Trains delivered steel from inland mills, while mobile cranes carried sub-assemblies across the yards. He even built his own housing projects, hospitals and schools for workers, understanding that morale was as vital as machinery. Kaiser called his philosophy speed through teamwork. His engineers called it organized miracle. The time the United States entered the war in December 1941, Kaiser's methods were already rewriting the rulebook. Where it had once taken 230 days to build a single cargo ship, his workers were finishing them in under 60s and improving every week. Each new Liberty ship that slid into the water was a symbol of what democracy could achieve when unleashed from bureaucracy. But Kaiser wasn't satisfied with 60 days. He wanted to see how fast America could really go. And soon, under his relentless drive, his shipyards would stage an experiment so extreme, so audacious, that even his own managers thought he had gone mad. An attempt to build a Liberty ship not in months or weeks, but in days. The result would make headlines across the world and force even the enemy to admit that the impossible was now routine. By 1942, Henry Kaiser's experiment had exploded into a national movement. Across America's coasts, from Portland, Oregon to Mobile, Alabama, and South Portland, Maine, new shipyards began rising from the mud almost overnight. Most of them were funded, designed, or directly managed by Kaiser's engineers. What had started as one man's wild idea had turned into an industrial crusade. Build ships faster than the enemy could sink them. The Liberty ship became the weapon of choice. It wasn't fast or beautiful. It was, in the words of naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison, a workhorse with the soul of a mule. But it could carry anything, and tanks, aircraft, locomotives, even entire field hospitals. The U.S. Maritime Commission set the goal, 2,700 Liberty ships. Kaiser promised to exceed it. At the heart of his empire stood Richmond Shipyards No. 1 through No. 4, a sprawling complex that covered over 880 acres along San Francisco Bay. From above, it looked like a living machine, steel arriving by rail, cut by torch, shaped into panels, welded into hulls, and floated to sea. It was unlike anything the world had ever seen. At its peak, the Richmond yards employed over 90,000 workers, nearly half of them women and minorities. Many had never worked with metal before. Some were farmhands, some housewives, some former miners. Kaiser believed skill could be taught, motivation could not. He created America's first large-scale industrial training schools, turning novices into welders in less than 2 weeks. The old shipyard guilds mocked him, but it worked. Production climbed, errors dropped, and morale soared. He also shattered another taboo: gender. At a time when women were discouraged from heavy industry, Kaiser not only hired them, he promoted them. Welders, crane operators, pipe fitters, foremen, all began wearing bandanas and overalls, their photographs soon symbolizing a new kind of patriotism. The media nicknamed them Rosie the Riveters. Kaiser's belief was simple and radical. Every American can build. Inside the yards, time became the true enemy. Every movement, every tool, every delivery was measured, analyzed, and improved. Assembly line principles borrowed from Ford's Willow Run were refined for the ocean. Prefabrication became a science. Entire hull sections were welded in parallel and transported on rolling platforms to the main slipways, where cranes the size of buildings lowered them into position with inch-perfect precision. In Kaiser's words, "We don't build ships, we assemble them." Each Liberty ship required over 250,000 individual components, but none were handcrafted anymore. Everything had a part number. Everything fit the same way every time. Mistakes were not punished. They were studied, eliminated, and used to teach others. Workers took pride in shaving off hours from each stage. The yards became a contest of speed and efficiency, a living embodiment of democracy's competitive spirit. The results stunned even the U.S. Navy. In 1941, the average construction time for a cargo ship was 230 days. By late 1942, Kaiser's yards had reduced it to 45 days, then to 30, then to under 3 weeks for emergency replacements. Some days, multiple ships were launched within hours of each other. Across the country, crowds gathered to watch. Bands played, workers cheered, and mothers christened vessels with bottles of champagne as the great hulls slid into the water. Proof that ordinary citizens could fuel an extraordinary War newsreels called them ships of freedom. The British called them the bridge across the Atlantic. And the Germans called them something else, ghost ships. U-boat commanders reported sinking, Liberty ships by the dozen, only to find new ones appearing in convoys the next week, as if materializing from nowhere. By early 1943, Allied losses at sea had begun to stabilize. Liberty ships were filling the gap faster than the Kriegsmarine could react. Every day, a new vessel left an American harbor bound for Britain, Africa, or the Pacific. The industrial tide had turned, not because of one weapon or one battle, but because of a process Henry, Kaiser, had transformed the art of shipbuilding into an act of mass production. But his ambitions were not satisfied with fast. He wanted unthinkable. In the autumn of 1942, he decided to test the limits of everything he had created, the workers, the system, and the very idea of possibility. He would attempt to build an entire ship in less than a week. The world would soon learn his name, and the name of the ship that proved him right, SS Robert E. Peary. By late 1942, the United States had become what Franklin D. Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. Factories across the nation worked without pause, but none symbolized that transformation more vividly than Henry Kaiser's shipyards. His operation at Richmond was not simply building ships, it was building a new kind of America. The scale of it defied imagination. Every 24 hours, more than 1,000 tons of steel entered the yards. Sparks from tens of thousands of welders turned night into day. From the air, the complex looked like a vast mechanical organism. Railways, cranes, foundries, workshops, and slipways moving in perfect rhythm. What had once been a craft dominated by master shipwrights was now an industrial ballet of ordinary people. Each worker performed one step, repeated endlessly, precisely timed. When joined together, their small motions became the synchronized heartbeat of a machine greater than any army. The secret of Kaiser's success wasn't merely his methods, it was his mindset. He had no interest in tradition, no reverence for how things had always been done. While naval officials clung to the culture of precision craftsmanship, Kaiser believed that perfection was the enemy of progress. Good enough on time, he said. Beats perfect, too late. He replaced the hierarchy of experts with a network of problem solvers. Engineers and welders worked side by side. Women ran quality control teams. Foremen were encouraged to take advice from anyone, even a first-week apprentice, and if it made the process faster. Mistakes were not punished. They were analyzed. A system that in Germany would have demanded blind obedience was, in Kaiser's America, fueled by creativity and trust. The effect on morale was electric. A 19-year-old welder named Eleanor Otto later recalled, "We didn't feel like workers. We felt like soldiers with torches." That sense of purpose transcended race and gender. Kaiser's shipyards were among the first major wartime industries to employ black workers in significant numbers. At a time when segregation still stained the nation, his hiring policy was blunt. If they can weld, they're hired. To avoid social unrest, he built entire new neighborhoods, complete with hospitals, schools, and recreation centers, where workers of all backgrounds lived side by side. Richmond became a living experiment in equality. His Kaiser Permanente health plan, originally created to care for his shipyard employees, would later become the model for one of America's most enduring healthcare systems. The war's industrial front was, in many ways, also its social front, and Kaiser was rewriting both. While the Allies marveled, the Axis watched with disbelief. German intelligence reports from 1943, intercepted after the war, revealed growing alarm. Abwehr agents in neutral ports such as Lisbon and Stockholm struggled to verify rumors that the United States could now build a ship every few days. One analyst in Berlin dismissed the claims as industrial exaggeration. Another wrote, "The Americans mistake quantity for quality. They are building floating coffins." But those coffins crossed the Atlantic by the hundreds, faster than the U-boats could sink them. In reality, the Liberty ship's very simplicity was its genius. Its parts were replaceable, its construction decentralized, and its design easy to repair. When torpedoed, many limped home and were welded back together. Some even survived multiple sinkings. To the Allies, they became symbols of endurance, proof that resilience could be manufactured. Kaiser's philosophy had achieved something deeper than speed. It had demonstrated that industrial democracy, freedom in the workplace, could be more efficient than dictatorship. In Germany, Albert Speer's Ministry of Armaments enforced order through fear and punishment. In Richmond, order emerged naturally from collaboration. The result was paradoxical but undeniable. Liberty was more productive than control. When Roosevelt visited the yards in 1942, he reportedly stood in awe at the assembly lines churning through the night. This, he said, is what we are fighting for. Yet even as production soared, Kaiser wasn't content. He knew that America's psychological edge mattered as much as its output. If he could show the world, and the enemy, that the United States could build a 10,000-ton ship in mere days, the message would be unmistakable. There was no limit to what democracy could achieve. And so, he issued a challenge that stunned even his own management team. Let's build one Liberty ship faster than anyone believes possible, not in weeks. In days, engineers protested. Schedulers warned it would break the system. Some thought it was a publicity stunt. Kaiser only smiled. Good, he said. Let them think it's impossible. That's when the real work begins. The stage was set. The chosen ship would be the SS Robert E. Peary, named after the famed Arctic explorer. A fitting symbol for an experiment that would push human endurance to the edge. Kaiser ordered thousands of workers into emergency shifts, working around the clock. Materials were pre-cut, welded sections pre-assembled, supplies stockpiled. Every movement of every worker was timed and rehearsed. And on November 8, 1942, the first steel plates were laid down. The clock started ticking. 4 days later, the world would see what impossible looked like when freedom held the torch. The challenge had been set. Build an ocean-going cargo ship from keel to launch in less than a week. Even among Henry Kaiser's boldest engineers, few believed it could be done. The task was monumental. A Liberty ship was not a small vessel. It weighed over 10,000 tons, required 250,000 parts, 200 miles of welding, and enough steel to fill a skyscraper. Yet Kaiser believed that what mattered most wasn't materials. It was coordination. So on November 8, 1942, at Yard Number 2 in Richmond, California, the clock started. The ship to carry the experiment's name, SS Robert E. Peary. Day 1. The first keel plates were lowered into place just after dawn. Every worker knew the schedule by heart. Prefabricated sections arrived on flatbed trucks from satellite yards. Cranes swung steel blocks into position with the rhythm of an orchestra. Women welders stood shoulder to shoulder with veterans from Hoover Dam and recruits from Oklahoma farms. Teams of electricians and pipe fitters waited like relay runners, each ready to take over the instant another finished. By nightfall, the skeleton of the ship's hull had taken shape. The smell of hot metal and burnt flux filled the air. The first 12 hours had already broken shipbuilding records. Day 2. The ship began to grow vertically. Bulkheads, decks, and frames were welded in continuous motion. Kaiser's logistics network worked flawlessly. While one shift built, another fabricated new sections off-site, ensuring no downtime. Spectators began gathering at the yard's perimeter, watching the impossible happen. Newspapers sent photographers. Radio stations broadcast updates every few hours, calling it the 4-day ship. The workers themselves fed on the energy. Many refused to leave after their shifts, volunteering through the night. Coffee stands appeared across the yard, and an industrial kitchen served hot meals around the clock. By sunset, the Peary already resembled a complete hull, something that had once taken half a year. Day 3. The superstructure rose. Cranes placed the bridge, smokestack, and masts. Electricians wired the ship while painters coated the hull as the welding sparks still flew. Every department moved in parallel, erasing the traditional sequence of shipbuilding. Reporters compared the pace to a military operation, but this was no army. There were no orders barked, no punishments for mistakes. Instead, a quiet sense of unity drove the effort. A collective understanding that history was being written in steel. Women hung banners reading "Can Do." From the scaffolding, Someone painted across a bulkhead. This ship was built by free people. By midnight, only the finishing touches remained. Lifeboats, rigging, and the final coats of gray naval paint. Day 4, November 12, 1942. A crowd of tens of thousands filled the Richmond waterfront. The workers, their families, and military officers stood shoulder to shoulder as the Peary prepared for launch. Bands played patriotic marches. Reporters from Life and Time jostled for photographs. At 11:12 a.m., with the sound of whistles and cheers, the great ship began to slide down the ways. The entire process, from keel laying to launch, had taken 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. No one in recorded history had ever built a ship that fast. The moment the Robert E. Peary hit the water, America's faith in its own industrial miracle was reborn. News spread instantly. The Associated Press headline read, "Ship built in 4 days, Kaiser does it again." British papers marveled. The Times of London called it a miracle of democracy's engineering. In Berlin, disbelief turned to alarm. German intelligence dismissed the feat as psychological warfare until photos confirmed it. One Luftwaffe analyst wrote, "If true, this defies comprehension. A shipyard is not a bakery," but it was true within a week. The Peary was outfitted and sailing for the Pacific, fully loaded with supplies for Allied troops. President Roosevelt, briefed on the accomplishment, called Kaiser personally. "You've done more," he said, "to win this war than all the speeches in Washington." Kaiser simply replied, "We just proved what Americans can do when no one tells them they can't." The Peary became an icon of industrial courage. Hollywood made short films about it. War posters used its image to rally bond sales. The U.S. Maritime Commission even used it in training manuals as proof of what organized freedom could achieve. But to Kaiser, the lesson was not about speed for its own sake. It was about proving a principle, that the impossible dissolves under collaboration. In Germany, the ripple effect was profound. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, later recalled reading about the Peary's launch and feeling a chill realization that we were doomed. His ministry, still producing ships and submarines by hand, could never match that tempo. While German factories relied on punishment and fear, Kaiser's relied on purpose and empowerment. What Speer saw as chaos, workers suggesting improvements, women supervising men, managers altering schedules on the fly, was in truth democracy in motion. By the end of 1943, the United States had built more ships than all Axis powers combined. Liberty ships, Victory ships, oil tankers. They filled the oceans in endless convoys, a metallic tide fueled by Henry Kaiser's philosophy. And while the Peary's 4-day record was never repeated, it didn't need to be. The point had been made. In a war defined by limits, one man had erased them. The Robert E. Peary sailed through the rest of the war without incident, delivering cargo to every corner of the Allied world. But her true legacy was not in the tonnage she carried. It was in the belief she carried. A belief that speed and skill, innovation and equality could live together. In that ship's steel hull was a lesson that would outlast the war itself. That when free people work with purpose, time itself bends. The launch of the SS Robert E. Peary was more than a record. It was a revelation. In 4 days, Henry Kaiser had shown that speed could be engineered, that the limits of production were not defined by machines, but by imagination, and the world took notice. Across the Atlantic, British dockyards that had struggled for years to keep pace with wartime demand watched in disbelief. German U-boats prowled the sea lanes, sinking Allied merchant ships faster than Britain could replace them. For every convoy that reached Liverpool, another was torn apart in the Atlantic's gray depths. Then came the Liberty ships, wave after wave of them, built by free hands at speeds that defied reason. The Peary was the symbol, but behind her stood an army of steel. By early 1943, Kaiser's methods had spread to every American coast. The U.S. Maritime Commission, working with the Navy and the Warshipping Administration, had turned shipbuilding into an exact science of logistics. Over 18 major yards were producing Liberty and Victory ships under a system of standardized design. Each plant used identical blueprints, identical tooling, and interchangeable prefabricated modules, a concept unheard of in shipbuilding before Kaiser. The result was a rhythm no enemy could match. In January 1943 alone, American yards launched 140 ships, more than the entire annual output of Germany and Japan combined. By summer, the Atlantic was no longer shrinking. It was swelling with steel. Convoys that once numbered dozens now numbered hundreds. Liberty ships carried everything from tanks to wheat, locomotives to entire airfields disassembled into crates. Each ship could haul over 9,000 tons of cargo, enough to feed an army division for a month. The equation had flipped. Germany could sink ships faster than anyone, but America could build them faster still. To the men of the U-boat fleet, it felt like fighting the tide itself. Captain Otto Kretschmer, one of Germany's top submarine commanders, later described his despair in his memoirs. For every ship we sent down, two took its place. It was as though the sea itself was making them. The Kriegsmarine called them Die Geisterflotte, the Ghost Fleet. Each Liberty ship carried the same silhouette, the same gray hull, the same steady speed of 11 knots. The repetition demoralized German crews. They sank one and another appeared within days, bearing the same name pattern, the same flag, the same defiance. What Kaiser had built was not just a fleet, it was a system of immortality. For Britain, the transformation was salvation. By 1943, the nation's food and fuel reserves had fallen to near collapse. The Battle of the Atlantic had cost nearly 15 million tons of shipping. Entire convoys were disappearing. Then came the American lifeline. Convoy HX-300, for example, the largest of the war, left New York in July 1944 with 166 merchant ships, most of them Liberties. They arrived in Liverpool unscathed. The success of that single voyage provided enough supplies to sustain British operations for weeks. Churchill, long haunted by the specter of starvation, wrote to Roosevelt, "You have given us the means to breathe again." And he wasn't exaggerating. By late 1943, for the first time since the war began, Allied shipping tonnage exceeded losses. The Battle of the Atlantic had quietly turned, not because of a new weapon, but because of mass production. The strategic ripple went even further. Every Allied invasion, North Africa, Sicily, Italy, Normandy, the Pacific Island hopping campaign, relied on the same unglamorous workhorses from Kaiser's yards. At Operation Torch in 1942, Liberty ships delivered the first wave of supplies to North Africa. At D-Day in 1944, over 300 of them formed the logistical backbone of the invasion fleet. In the Pacific, they carried airstrips, fuel, and soldiers from island to island, transforming empty atolls into launch pads for bombers. It was not the battleships or carriers that made America's global war machine possible. It was the gray, uncelebrated Liberty ship, welded together by farmers, students, and women with calloused hands. Henry Kaiser became both a hero and a paradox. He had entered the war as an outsider, a civilian builder with no naval rank. Yet by 1943, he wielded more influence over Allied logistics than many admirals. The press dubbed him the man who outbuilt Hitler. Time magazine called him the miracle manager. But Kaiser himself shunned the spotlight. When asked how he had achieved the impossible, he gave a characteristically humble answer. "I didn't. They did. All I did was make it possible for them to try." Those words captured the essence of his revolution. Not genius at the top, but trust at the bottom. His shipyards ran on empowerment, not fear. Mistakes were corrected, not punished. People were valued for what they could learn, not where they came from. It was an industrial democracy. And it worked. By late 1943, Allied strategists finally began to grasp what Kaiser had created. Logistics officers started referring to the American shipbuilding system as a second front. One British admiral called it the silent invasion, an unstoppable advance of tonnage and time. In 1941, the United States had been the sleeping giant. By 1943, thanks to Henry Kaiser and his Liberty ships, that giant was fully awake and moving faster than any empire in history. The war had entered its industrial climax. And soon the very machines built at Kaiser's yards would help carry the Allies to the threshold of victory. By 1944, the Liberty ship had become as essential to Allied victory as any tank or aircraft. What began as an experiment in speed had evolved into the lifeline of the free world, the invisible bridge that linked factories in America to front lines thousands of miles away. Every bullet fired in Normandy, every ration eaten by a soldier in Italy, every drop of aviation fuel burned over Berlin, it had all crossed the ocean in the steel belly of a Liberty ship. Henry Kaiser's revolution had not just changed production, it had changed the tempo of war itself. The Allies were preparing for their boldest gamble, Operation Overlord, the invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe. To succeed, it would require an unprecedented logistical feat, millions of men, vehicles, and tons of material ferried across the English Channel in secret. While generals debated strategy, shipyards labored relentlessly. By early 1944, Kaiser's yards were launching so many vessels that entire harbors were filled with Liberty ships, waiting to be assigned to convoys. Some ports became so congested that Navy officials joked, "We're winning faster than we can park." In total, more than 2,700 Liberty ships were completed, nearly double the goal the Maritime Commission had once thought impossible. The numbers told the story. Each ship, 441 feet long, 10,000 tons of steel. Each could carry 3,000 jeeps, or 2,840 vehicles, or 9,000 tons of cargo. Total cargo moved over 130 million tons across the globe before the war's end. No single invention or weapon in the Allied arsenal had multiplied America's reach more dramatically. On June 6, 1944, as dawn broke over the beaches of Normandy, Liberty ships stood just offshore, unloading supplies into landing craft and amphibious trucks. Their hulls bristled with anti-aircraft guns, manned not by sailors, but by merchant mariners, civilians defending the floating veins of invasion. They carried fuel, shells, rations, and medical supplies, the pulse of the Allied assault. For the men storming Omaha and Utah beaches, those gray silhouettes in the distance represented more than logistics. They were home, a reminder that behind every soldier stood a factory, a family, a nation that refused to stop building. One U.S. Navy officer later wrote, "We did not win Normandy with tanks or aircraft. We won it with steel hulls and stubborn welders." Across the world, the same pattern repeated. In the Pacific, Liberty ships became the arteries of an island-hopping campaign stretching from Hawaii to Okinawa. They carried bulldozers and airstrips, radio towers and prefabricated hospitals, the literal foundations of American advance. At Saipan, Guam, and Leyte, they offloaded supplies under fire, sometimes beaching themselves deliberately to deliver their cargo. Some were sunk by kamikazes, others were salvaged, patched, and sent back out again within weeks. The Navy called them expendable. But to the men on the front, they were irreplaceable. They carried no glory, but they carried victory. By the war's final year, Kaiser's empire of efficiency had reached its zenith. His shipyards were building one vessel every 5 hours across the entire system. His workforce had surpassed 300,000 men and women, spread across 7 states. The Liberty ship had evolved into its successor, the Victory ship, faster, longer, and better armed, but born of the same philosophy: simplicity, repetition, teamwork. Even after the tide of war turned, Kaiser's assembly lines didn't slow. He believed that peace too would need rebuilding, that the lessons of wartime industry could rebuild a broken world. He was already dreaming of new projects: housing for returning soldiers, affordable health care, peacetime infrastructure. He once told a reporter, "We proved we could move mountains in war. Now we'll do it for the future." Meanwhile, in Berlin, the German High Command finally understood what had destroyed them. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, later confessed in his memoirs, "We lost the war when we could no longer replace our losses, and America could." He admitted that Germany had no answer to the Liberty ship, no system of decentralized, interchangeable production that could rival the openness of Kaiser's model. Speer's factories were trapped by ideology, order without freedom, perfection without speed. The Liberty ship, in contrast, was imperfect but abundant, the industrial embodiment of democracy itself. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, over 200 Liberty ships lay at the bottom of the oceans, but more than 2,400 still sailed, supplying not just armies but the world's post-war recovery. They carried food to war-torn Europe under the Marshall Plan, ferried refugees, and helped rebuild shattered ports and railways. The ships that had once fed war now fed peace. And Henry Kaiser? He had become one of America's greatest builders, a man whose legacy extended beyond steel. He went on to found the Kaiser Aluminum Corporation, Kaiser Permanente Healthcare, and major post-war construction firms that shaped modern America. Yet to the end of his life, he remained most proud of those 4 days in 1942, when a team of ordinary Americans proved that impossible was just a word waiting to be rewritten. The Robert E. Peary's record was never broken. It didn't need to be. The point had been made forever. In the war of ideas, freedom could outbuild fear. The Liberty ship was not a marvel of engineering perfection. It was a triumph of human spirit. And in that spirit lay the real weapon of democracy. The belief that when free people unite behind a common purpose, there are no limits to what they can build. When the war ended in 1945, the oceans were crowded not with warships but with victory itself. Liberty ships, once hurriedly welded together in the shadow of fear, now moved across calm seas under peacetime skies. Their gray hulls, streaked with rust and memory, carried not soldiers or bombs but hope. The global map had changed forever, and so had industry. For the first time in human history, nations had witnessed speed as a form of power. Henry Kaiser's 4-day miracle had shown that the line between impossible and routine could be erased by organization, trust, and the will to adapt. In the post-war world, his methods would no longer be confined to shipyards. They would shape the entire modern economy. The U.S. government faced a new challenge: what to do with nearly 3,000 Liberty ships. Many were too slow for the jet age that followed. Yet they were too valuable to discard. Hundreds were sold to private shipping companies at scrap prices, repainted, and put to work in global trade. Others were loaned or given to allied nations rebuilding their shattered economies. Britain, Greece, Norway, and Italy all rebuilt their merchant fleets with Liberty hulls. The ships that had carried war supplies now carried grain, machinery, and reconstruction materials, the same cargo of survival, but for a different battle: rebuilding civilization. Through the late 1940s and 1950s, Liberty ships became the backbone of the Marshall Plan, delivering food and raw materials to a starving Europe. In ports from Hamburg to Marseille, long lines of civilians watched the same vessels that had once brought destruction now deliver life. They had become the ambassadors of peace. Quiet, steel reminders of how industrial unity could heal what it once fought to protect. For Henry Kaiser, peace brought both opportunity and transformation. He had entered the war as an outsider, a dam builder, a risk-taker, and emerged as the architect of modern American industry. But he wasn't content to rest on wartime success. Kaiser believed that the same ideas that built ships in 4 days could build a better society. He moved his empire from shipyards to construction sites and factories, pioneering new methods in prefabricated housing, aluminum production, and post-war healthcare. In 1945, he founded Kaiser Aluminum, applying the same assembly line logic to lightweight metals that would soon define aviation and automobiles. In the same year, he expanded the medical plan he had created for his shipyard workers, the Kaiser Permanente Health Plan, into a national model for affordable healthcare. What began as a wartime necessity had become one of the most enduring legacies of American public welfare. He called it the peace dividend. Meanwhile, the Liberty ships kept sailing, though their age began to show. They were never meant to last more than 5 years, but many served for decades. By the 1960s, most had been scrapped, their steel recycled into new bridges, cars, and buildings. A few survived as museum pieces, floating memorials to a time when ordinary people had done extraordinary things. One of them, the SS Jeremiah O'Brien, still sails today, fully restored and docked in San Francisco. She is one of only 2 Liberty ships preserved in working condition. Her engines still thrum with the sound of 1940s America, the rhythm of welders, cranes, and factory whistles that once outpaced the darkness. When she steamed across the Atlantic in 1994 to commemorate the 50th anniversary of D-Day, Old shipyard workers and veterans watched from the shore, tears in their eyes. They knew that beneath her decks lay more than steel. There lay proof, and proof that when a free people are challenged, they can answer with creation instead of destruction. The war had ended, but Kaiser's lesson had not. He had shown that innovation thrives not in secrecy, but in openness, that strength lies not in fear, but in faith. His shipyards had been loud, chaotic, and imperfect, yet out of that noise had come precision. Out of that freedom had come order, and out of that experiment had come victory. In the decades that followed World War II, the influence of Henry Kaiser's shipyards reached far beyond the ocean. The Liberty ship may have been a wartime vessel, but its true cargo was an idea, that ordinary citizens empowered by organization and purpose could achieve what once belonged only to giants. That idea would become the foundation of the modern industrial world. Kaiser's wartime principles, prefabrication, parallel construction, decentralized teamwork, and worker welfare became the blueprint for a new kind of economy. Factories, highways, and even cities would be built according to lessons first learned in his yards. The post-war American boom, the rise of suburbs, the interstate highway system, and the global dominance of U.S. manufacturing all echoed the rhythms of Richmond and Portland. When Boeing began mass-producing aircraft in the 1950s, engineers cited Kaiser's methods as the template for scaling production without losing quality. Automakers, home builders, and even electronics firms adapted his concept of modular assembly. Across the Atlantic, Britain and France studied his production miracle as they rebuilt after the war. Japan, devastated by Allied bombing, adopted similar efficiency systems in its reconstruction, combining Kaiser's principles with its own culture of precision, a fusion that would, within decades, make Japan an industrial powerhouse. The speed that once launched a ship every 4 days now launched an era, yet amid the prosperity, the legacy of the Liberty ship remained deeply human. For millions of women and minorities, Kaiser's shipyards had been their first gateway to skilled labor. Those years in the welding bays and assembly lines broke barriers that no legislation had yet achieved. Women who had once been dismissed as temporary workers returned, home after the war, but carried with them a new identity and a new expectation. They had built ships that crossed oceans. They had proved that competence had no gender. The same applied to the thousands of African American workers who had found opportunity and dignity in Kaiser's merit-based system. Though the world would take decades to fully recognize it, the Liberty shipyards were an early front in the long struggle for equality. Kaiser himself later said, "If I could build ships with every race, creed, and color working side by side, then we can build a nation that way too." It was not rhetoric. It was experience. Economists would later describe the Kaiser era as the birth of mass collaboration. Unlike traditional command economies or top-down hierarchies, Kaiser's system thrived on autonomy. Thousands of small decisions made by individuals aligned toward a single, massive goal. It was industrial democracy in motion, an economy that reflected the very principles America claimed to defend. That, more than the ships themselves, was the weapon that defeated tyranny. Because where dictatorship demanded obedience, democracy invited participation. Where totalitarianism forced perfection, freedom embraced innovation. And that difference, multiplied by thousands of workers and millions of hours, changed the outcome of the war and the direction of history. The surviving Liberty ships became relics of that transformation. Some were refitted as training vessels or floating storage depots. Others were sold to private carriers and continued trading for decades. In every ocean, from the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean, one could still find the slow, steady hum of a Liberty engine long after the flags of war had come down. One ship, the SS John W. Brown, became a school for merchant mariners. Another, the SS Jeremiah O'Brien, lived on as a museum. And in 1994 she sailed under her own power to Normandy to mark the 50th anniversary of D-Day. When she docked in France, veterans and shipyard workers stood together on her deck, silent under the weight of memory. Some had been teenagers when they built her. Others had watched her sisters go to sea and never return. The old welders looked at the Liberty's steel hull and said what every generation since has come to understand. We didn't just build ships. We built history. Today, the rusted remains of Liberty ships rest quietly on the seafloor, scattered across the world's oceans, silent witnesses to the power of ordinary hands. Their bones have become reefs, their memory, a foundation. And yet in every modern factory that hums with synchronized motion, in every workplace that prizes teamwork over hierarchy, and in every innovation that values people as much as machines, the ghost of Henry Kaiser's vision still works the night shift, because the real legacy of the Liberty ship was never about steel or speed. It was about faith in what free people can do when they believe in each other. In every war, there are battles fought with bullets, and battles fought with belief. Henry Kaiser fought the latter. He never commanded armies or carried a weapon. His battlefield was the shipyard, his soldiers ordinary men and women, his ammunition time. And in 4 days he proved that freedom could build faster than fear could destroy. The Liberty ship was not beautiful. It was not perfect. It groaned, leaked, and sometimes cracked in cold seas. But perfection was never its purpose. Production was. It existed to carry the weight of democracy across oceans, to bridge the gap between promise and survival. Each welded seam, each spark that lit the Richmond sky, was a declaration of what America believed about itself, that the impossible bends to collective will. In those 4 days, the Robert E. Peary did more than launch. It changed the definition of what was possible. When Henry Kaiser looked across his shipyards, he didn't see chaos. He saw coordination. He saw a nation discovering its rhythm. The clang of hammers, the blaze of torches, the roar of cranes. Together they became a hymn to human capability. And when the war was over, that rhythm didn't stop. It continued in the factories that built homes, highways, and hospitals. The same music of progress that defined the modern age. Because Kaiser's true gift wasn't a ship, it was a system. A belief that innovation is not the privilege of experts but the right of everyone willing to try. That was the secret Germany never understood. That liberty, for all its noise and imperfection, could outproduce tyranny precisely because it trusted its people. Today, few remember the Robert E. Peary by name, but every time a team defies the odds, every time collaboration turns chaos into creation, her story is retold. In the end, the Liberty ships did more than win a war. They proved that freedom, once organized, is the most powerful engine ever built. And Henry Kaiser, the man who built a ship in 4 days, left behind something greater than steel. He left behind proof that hope can be manufactured.